I'm bullish on Bitcoin, but I'm reasonable, right? Bitcoin has gone up a lot, right? It's gone from under $1 to about $100,000 or so, more or take, depending on when you're watching this video. And it can go higher, it can go a lot higher. But people calling for $1 million or $5 million Bitcoin, those people are a little crazy, I think, right? We got to be reasonable. It's possible to be optimistic on something without becoming some sort of cultist to think that it's going to the moon magically forever, right? Wrong. Bitcoin is going way higher than what you expect. And it's actually more reasonable to talk about stupid high price targets than mediocre price targets, right? It is less reasonable to say that the internet is only going to be the same size as the telegraph. It is more reasonable to say if the internet survives, it's going to be bigger. So in today's video, we're not going to talk about $100,000, $500,000, or even $5 million Bitcoin. We're going to talk about a $500 million Bitcoin and why I do not think it is nearly as absurd as most people might believe. So without further ado, let's get right into it. This is a big claim that probably melts a lot of people's brains and it freaks people out in the comments. And people all the time tell me that I'm crazy for saying that Bitcoin's going to go to 10 million, let alone 30 million, let alone $500 million a coin. So why do I believe this? Why do I think that this is far more likely than Bitcoin going to zero? Why do I believe that? Well, let's go through a few different steps. There's a timeline of history, right? Time flows into the future from the past. And something I say a lot is about how we have less in common with the future than the past. To me, this is an obvious statement. It's not necessarily an optimistic statement or a pessimistic statement. It's just true. Maybe you're a technological accelerationist and optimist, and you think that AI is going to take over the world, and you think that the whole world is going to change, that modern technology is going to become incredibly outdated over the course of the next couple of decades. Good for you. You're an optimist. We have less in common with the future than the past. Maybe you're a doomer, and you think, oh, the whole world's going to blow up, and everybody's going to starve, and technology's going to stop, and we're going to stop momentum, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, you can believe that. We still have less in common with the future than the past. And throughout time, let's say this is the year 0. Let's say this is the year -2000, and let's say this is the year 2075, okay? On this timeline, over roughly the last 4,000 years, we are somewhere over here, right? We're much closer to 2075 than we are to -2000, right? Or 2000 BC, right? 2000 BC. You know what I mean, right? There's 0, there's 2000 BC, there's 50 years from now, and here's today, right? Here is 2025, right there, okay? Here's the first thing we have to talk about before we can talk about the $500 million Bitcoin. Bitcoin does not create wealth, right? It's just an accounting system. Now, most people look at that and they say, well, then you're crazy for saying that Bitcoin's going to go up forever. Yeah, but you have to understand, before we can talk about the accounting system to measure the future world's wealth, we have to talk about the future world's wealth in the first place, right? It's nonsensical to put the cart in front of the horse, right? So we have to talk about the future world's wealth. Now, if you've ever seen a population chart of the human race, you know that it's been, growing, and then now it's been exploding since the Industrial Revolution, okay? But here's something to think about. The main constraint for productivity over time, the main constraint for technology expanding over time, the main limitation is human time. It is the limit of human progress. It is the bottleneck, right? If you have 4,000 years ago, if you have 100 million people on the planet, that means that at most, you can have 100 million years of effort to a given task or productivity or new ingenuity, right? Compare that to today, where there are 8 billion people in the world, and you literally have 80 times the amount of productivity today that we did, thousands of years ago, right? But here's the thing most people aren't factoring in or considering. The reason why artificial intelligence is a big deal, the reason why automation is a big deal, the reason why robotics is a big deal is that it makes human productivity more efficient. Okay, you can have 100 million people 4,000 years ago putting in 100 million years of productivity per year, but most of that productivity is going to farming. It's going to, putting a shovel in the ground or putting a hoe in the ground or something, right? Compare that to today, or even more so the near future. A single hour of human work is going to be far more productive than a single hour in the past. So when you quantify all this together, and I know what I'm about to say might sound crazy, but I believe, and I've done the math numerous times, I've obsessed over it over a long time, I genuinely believe 80% of all productivity hours between this timeline here is in the next 50 years, okay? I genuinely believe that because when I do the math of how many people are coming in the next 50 years and how many people are alive today, plus factor in AI and robotics and conservative growth rates for those kinds of technologies, for every hour of global productivity we will have had thousands of years ago, we're going to have literally hundreds, if not thousands times more every single year over the course of the next 50 years. And so maybe 50 years is too long of a time horizon for your tiny little goldfish brain, but for most people watching this video, they're going to be around in 50 years, right? And additionally, on top of that, it is entirely possible that as a result of having 80% of the productivity hours in the next 50 years, it's entirely possible we extend human lives. And you may think, oh, I'm going to be dead in 50 years. And maybe that's true. Maybe you're dead tomorrow. But there's a very real, non-zero chance 2075 is in your lifetime, okay? And so this is the thing you have to understand. We have less in common than your future in the past. Maybe it's not 80%. Maybe it's 60%. I think it could be more like 90%, okay? But it's a large percentage. The total number of hours of productivity contributing to the global share, the global pie of wealth, the majority of hours are in the next 50 years, not the last 4,000 years. That is critical to understand. And so, with all that said, this is the wealth. Now we need a way to communicate that wealth. We need a way to share that wealth from point A to point B. And so we have to ask that question. What is the best kind of value transfer system over time as we create more wealth? What is the best way to do that? Well, it's this little thing we call money. Okay, we're going to have a big circle here. We're going to have a couple smaller circles over here. Okay, why is Luke drawing circles? Okay, here, let's say in a simple system, we have a pie, right? We have a pie, and I have half, you have half. Okay, this represents the world's wealth, right? There's two people right now, all the way back here, you know, way long ago. For oversimplification, let's say there's two people. I have half the world's money, you have half the world's money, right? This is an accounting system we use to measure who owes whom what value and who owns what value, right? I have half, you have half. But you've entrusted me with the guns, you've entrusted me with the village's stockpile of grain or whatever, right? And I decide, you know what? I'm going to double the number of currency units in circulation. You still have your one currency unit, but you just lost half of your purchasing power, right? You used to have 50% of the world's wealth, but now you only have 25% of the world's wealth. With an accounting trick, with no new wealth creation, I create new currency units, and now you've lost half your wealth. Now let's say I do it again. Let's say I double the currency units again. Well, guess what? Your one share of the global pie of wealth has gone from half to a quarter, now to an eighth. You own only 1/8 of the world's wealth, right? And guess what? That feedback loop, if I'm the person in charge, my entire system is dependent on that. I have to steal from you at a faster and faster rate, because the first time, right, you lost half of your wealth. But guess what? For me, the parasite in this situation, sure, I gained 25% of the world's wealth when I stole half from you, but this next time, I only stole half as much. So sure, you're still losing half and half and half of your purchasing power every single time I double the currency units, but I'm getting less and less and less juice relative to the squeeze. Every single time I create more currency units, you have the same amount of pain. You're losing another half of your wealth, but in relation to what I already have, it's smaller and smaller and smaller. This is not sustainable. This is a Ponzi scheme. This eventually must fail, because eventually I'm going to have stolen so much from you as we get smaller and smaller and smaller that every time I try to squeeze you one last time, I'm going to run out and the whole thing's going to fall apart, right? So there are two assumptions you need to make when deciding what form of money to hold your wealth in as you hold energy into the future, right? Assumption number one, assumption number two. Assumption number one is you need the whole pie to remain valuable. And assumption number two is you need your share of the pie to remain consistent. So assumption number one is that you need the entire system to retain value, right? You want to have the total pie of global wealth be worth more in the future than the past, right? You want the currency system that you have your energy plugged into to be worth $100 trillion and not $1 trillion, right? And as long as the total pie grows, like, you're fine, right? So that's the first thing you need to assume when you're deciding where to store your money, is that the total market capitalization, the total size of the pie needs to stay consistent or ideally grow. But question number two is that you need to make sure your share of the pie also remains a consistent size, right? And every single asset in the world has a trade-off with these, right? Let's talk about the obvious one, which is US dollars. US dollars are a very large pie, right? And since 1945, right, since 1945 at the end of World War II, the total pie of America has grown a lot. America has a lot more power, a lot more productivity and wealth now in 2025 than it did in 1945. The total pie has grown a lot. But a dollar today doesn't buy what a dollar in 1945 did. Why is that? It's because assumption number 2 doesn't hold up. We diluted the shares of the pie so much that you've been diluted and you've actually lost purchasing power if you held dollars, right? Let's compare that to a stock. A stock is the same kind of concept, right? If you're going to buy stock in a company, the first assumption you need to have is that the company, the total share of the pie, is going to survive in the future. The second assumption you need to have is that you're not going to be diluted to zero as you hold a share of that pie, right? Let's take another example, which is gold. Gold. Why gold? Well, gold, the good thing with gold is that it's very hard to dilute the shares of gold, right? To dilute the shares of gold, you have to take a shovel and go out into the wilderness and convert dirt into gold, which is very energy intensive. It's very time intensive, right? It takes a lot of productivity to do, right? Actually, as a funny side note, we produce more gold every few days than we did in an entire year a few thousand years ago, even though gold was a much larger share of global wealth, right? We have less in common in the future than the past. And so gold is much better at number 2, assumption number 2, at preserving your share of the pie. It's much better. It's not perfect, but it's much better. However, where gold falters is that it's not nearly as good at number 1. Gold is not nearly as good as being technologically native at allowing the total share of global pie of the global pie to grow. So gold is very good at preserving your purchasing power within the current system, within the global pie of the gold market cap, but the gold market cap has a difficulty in general of growing consistently over time because it's very difficult to transact, and the velocity, meaning the speed at which transactions can occur, is very slow. So all of these have a different trade-off, right? You have main 3 uses of money that everybody probably knows, right? You have store of value, you have medium of exchange, and you have unit of account, right? Gold is a great unit of account, right? Because gold follows assumption 2, and it retains your share of the purchasing power. And so you typically price stocks or political currencies in terms of gold. So gold is a great unit of account, right? A medium of exchange, what's a good medium of exchange? Well, it's the dollar because it's consistent and the pie of the dollar is huge on the world, right? But it's not a great store of value because, you know, you get diluted when you hold it, right? And then as far as a store of value, stocks have been a far better store of value than gold over the last 100 years or so. Why? Because even though you get diluted in stocks more than you do in gold, the reality is that the pie is growing so fast as technology gets faster and faster and faster that it generally makes up for it. And so we have different asset classes around the world that have different pros and cons, right? Every single one has their own trade-offs within the different kinds of use cases of money. So why, then, is Bitcoin better? Why is Bitcoin better? Bitcoin is over here. Bitcoin is that tiny little baby circle that nobody cares about, right? You probably can't even see that, you know. I mean, it's tiny, right? Surely it's going to fade away. Surely it's going to snap out of existence. The people calling for a $500,000 Bitcoin are crazy, right? Let alone the people calling for $500 million of Bitcoin, right? How on earth could they know that thing's going to survive, right? Well, the thing with Bitcoin is that it's a tiny pie, sure, but it is a pie that perfectly can't be diluted like any of these other asset classes I've talked about, right? The Bitcoin pie is resistant against future attacks. It is resistant against dilutive attacks, right? Let's blow up this Bitcoin pie real quick. That was an awful circle. Oh my goodness, I cannot stand that. Holy cow, give me just a second. I have to redo that. That was despicable. I'm gonna get a lot of dislikes for that. Anyway, this is a moderately better circle, all right? This is the Bitcoin circle, right? This is BTC, okay? BTC circle, okay? We're zooming it in. I know it's tiny on the global stage, right? This is the dollar, this is the stock market, this is the Chinese currency, blah, blah, blah. Bitcoin's a tiny little baby circle. We're blowing it up to look like a big circle, okay? How does Bitcoin protect itself against dilutive attacks? Well, I'm gonna summarize here, and it's not necessarily gonna be technically true, but the heart of what I'm saying is true, and it's the right concept to have about it, right? So the way Bitcoin works is that it issues new tokens within the network, right? It dilutes the network constantly. Every 10 minutes, there is a new dilution of currency units in the network. Well, look, that sounds just like the political currencies and the stocks and the gold like you were talking about earlier. Why is it any better? Here's why it's better. Because those new currency units are given to entities that are plugging in electricity, quote unquote, into the network. People are spending real power that they had to take from a coal plant or a nuclear plant or a hydro jam. They're taking real power and converting it into electricity and plugging it into Bitcoin in exchange for getting some currency units, right? And so essentially, while they are helping the network at putting more electricity behind what is called the hashes of the network and making it more difficult to rewrite previous transactions, while they are helping the network in that way, it's basically a donation network, they are also attacking the network, so to speak, from a dilution perspective. The network is giving people an incentive to dilute it, right? It's giving people an incentive to do that, but in the end, it's a net win for the entire network, right? Basically, if I am a Bitcoin miner, right, if I am somebody trying to get new currency units from the system, I have to contribute new energy, new electricity, new power into the system. I have to make the global pie, the whole electricity pie of the network, larger. I have to put more energy behind the network, bigger, and in exchange, I get a tiny little fraction of new currency units from the network, right? So for me, it's a net win because I'm spending energy and getting more purchasing power back. And for the network, it's a win because the whole network is getting more secure as more energy and more computational power goes behind the hashes that are making the whole thing secure, right? Back in 2010, Bitcoin was basically nothing, right? Now, Bitcoin uses literally trillions of times more energy than it did a mere 15 years ago, right? How could Bitcoin monetize into that? It's because of this exact thing. Every single time we try to dilute more currency, unlike a political currency or a stock or gold, something like that, it's a smaller and smaller and smaller share, right? In the first 4 years, half of the Bitcoin came into existence. Then in the next 4 years, half of the Bitcoin came into existence, right? So first it was 10.5 million Bitcoin, then it was 5.25 million Bitcoin, then it was half of that, then it was half of that, then it's 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 half, 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 right? So the whole network is getting diluted at a slower and slower and slower rate. The dilution is slowing over time, but the total energy being plowed into trying to make the pie bigger is growing over time. And so what this means is that it is a perfect feedback loop, right? And contrasting that to political currency, where the more you get diluted, the more and the faster you have to be diluted to keep the Ponzi going and the interest rates. Bitcoin is totally different because the more energy people put it in to make the pie a little bit bigger, and then a little bit bigger, and then a little bit bigger, right? The more energy people put in to make the whole share of the pie greater, the smaller and smaller the dilution is for everybody in the network. And so when does it end? Well, it ends in approximately the year 2140, which is out to here on the timeline, right? So this is an additional 65 years after 2075, right? This dilution network happens an additional 65 years after 2075, right? And people say that, oh, well, Bitcoin is young and Bitcoin isn't nearly as old as gold and therefore it's not as good. But you have to keep in mind that by the time Bitcoin survives to 2075, let alone 2140, Bitcoin is going to have way more human productivity hours behind it than everything else in human history. Because there's so many more people and so many more robotics, automation, and AIs that people in the future have, right? So that's why Bitcoin is better. Bitcoin gives the trade-off of having dilution over time, of a diminishing amount of dilution over time for an ever greater amount of growing the pie. And so another way to think of it is, I think, like a measuring stick of the universe, right? So let's say over here, let's take a little detour and then come back to this, right? So let's say over here, we have a chart. Okay, let's see. Here we have speed, and over here we have energy, right? They're going from zero energy to infinite energy, and from zero speed to the speed of light, the speed of c, right? Now, if you want to propel an object, right? If I want to propel this little marker faster and faster and faster, I have to use more and more energy, right? I could put some energy behind it and send it, through the air here, but I have to put energy into that, right? Nothing in the universe is free, including money, right? So if I want to send anything at a faster and faster speed, I can get forever closer to the speed of light but I can't quite get there, right? Because it would take an infinite amount of energy to reach the speed of light. And so if I was to put it on a chart of how much energy would I have to put into this marker to throw it, right? If I had to do that, it would be, faster and faster and faster, and then it's insurmountable, right? Let's take another example. Let's take that of temperature, right? In the same kind of scenario, let's have energy on the y-axis here. We'll have 0, 0, and absolute 0, 0 Kelvin, okay? So the Kelvin system has absolute 0 as the bottom baseline of the system, and it's the same kind of thing with the concept of the speed of light. The speed of light is a measuring stick we can use for everything in the universe, right? I can quantify the rate at which everything moves relative to everything else in terms of the speed of light. Can I touch the speed of light? No. Can I ever reach the speed of light? No. But we know it exists, right? The same thing is true with absolute 0, with 0 Kelvin, with the negative 278 or whatever it is, right? That is also a constant in the universe. Can we reach it? No, because it would take an infinite amount of energy to reach it, right? And so, why am I talking about this? Bitcoin is the same exact concept, except with economics, except with the concept of digital scarcity. Why is this a big deal? Why can't it be replicated? And why is it going to $500 million a coin and then well beyond that? It's because it is the concept of digital scarcity that we do not know how to reproduce. I don't know how to reproduce it. If I knew how to reproduce it, I'd be printing currency units every single day and making money off of that, right? It's so funny when people comment and they say, oh, look, you just say Bitcoin's going to millions of dollars because you're biased. You own Bitcoin and blah, blah, blah. Well, sure, I'm biased, but so are you. Everybody's biased. If I knew how to crack Bitcoin, don't you think I would do it? If I could create magical tokens out of thin air with no energy expenditure and convert it into real purchasing power in my pocket, don't you think I would do it? If Vladimir Putin knew how to create $1 trillion out of thin air by attacking Bitcoin, don't you think he would do it? What about Michael Saylor? What about Jeff Booth? What about everybody in Bitcoin? Don't you think every single one of us has gone through this exact question of obsessing over how can we kill this thing? How can we replace it? How can we make a better Bitcoin? Because if Bitcoin can die, it deserves to die. But I have obsessed over this thing for years, and I don't know how to kill it. Just like with the speed of light, just like with absolute 0. I do not know how to get to the speed of light. And I firmly believe I can't do it. I don't know how to reach absolute 0. And because I don't think I can do it. It doesn't even compute for me how I can have an infinite amount of energy, even if I converted every star in the universe into energy. I don't know how to reach that absolute maximum speed. I don't know how to reach that absolute minimum temperature, right? So, why do I say it's the same thing with Bitcoin? With Bitcoin, we have energy, 0, looks more like an 8 than an infinity sign, but we have 0 energy to infinite energy, and we have 0 to 21 million, from no currency units to all the currency units. It's the same kind of concept. It takes very little energy, and then it's going to take a near infinite amount of energy. It takes very little energy to create the first 10.5 million Bitcoin. It took very little energy. People were doing it on their laptops, right? I know many people that were mining the block rewards back in 2010, 2011, 2012, right? People that were spending literally thousands of Bitcoin on machines to get hundreds of Bitcoin back. People that were mining 50 Bitcoin block rewards, that mined multiple 50 Bitcoin block rewards, right? And of course, most people lost all those Bitcoin because they were worth like nothing at the time. But the point is, every additional share of dilution in this accounting system, the ever closer we get to that 21 million number, the ever closer we can get closer and closer and closer, but we'll never quite reach there. And every new iteration, it takes a greater amount of energy to create that new dilution. We are getting ever closer to this point where it's going to be the year 2140, and you could spend as much energy as you want, and we don't know how to get the last 1 cent. So Bitcoin is much more in common with other constants of the universe. Am I saying that Bitcoin, the technology, is equivalent to an absolute law of physics? No. But the mathematical concept of digital scarcity is. The speed of light is basically a mathematical concept. Kelvin is basically a mathematical concept. And we use human numbers to communicate that, right? The speed of light is whatever, it is 200 million meters a second, right? Like the meter stick is an arbitrary number we have used to describe the speed of light. We have a specific fraction that describes the speed of light, right? if you destroyed all the textbooks in the world and you destroyed all the science and everything, the speed of light would still exist. The concept of the speed of light would still exist. But we would recreate a new measuring system, and instead of maybe 200 millimeters per second of light in a vacuum, maybe it'd be a different number, right? The same concept's true with the Kelvin system. Like, the concept of absolute zero is not something that humans created, right? That's something that God made, right? We didn't make that, but we made up the numbers to describe it. The same concept is true with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is just a numerical system, okay? The numbers don't matter. It doesn't matter if it was called Bitcoin or unicorn coin or orange coin or green coin. Like, the name is irrelevant. Satoshi Nakamoto, it could have been a different person, it could have been a different place and time. But the concept of mathematical scarcity is something I don't know how to reproduce. Because once this gets going and we have an accounting system that remains finite in the currency units and more energy is being plowed and plowed and plowed in, I don't know how to recreate that. This is why people call Bitcoin the monetary singularity. This is why people call Bitcoin kind of like a black hole. Because every other currency system is not like this. Every other currency system, for the sake of example, right? Again, infinite energy, zero currency, infinite currency, right? Every other currency system, you can do whatever the heck you want. You want to print more currency? Okay. Boom, print it up. Boom, more currency units. Boom, more currency units, right? Every other system, we don't know how to recreate digital scarcity when there's not a direct energy tie to it, right? With the speed of light, there's an energy tie to it. With absolute zero, there's an energy tie to it. And with Bitcoin, there's an energy tie to it. Every new dilution of the currency system requires more electricity spent to it. So, what on earth does this have to do with 500 million bucks in Bitcoin? Well, we have all these global circles. What do I think is going to happen over the course of the next 50 years in this critical time where 80% of the global productivity hours in the next 50 years, not the last 4,000 years? What do I think is going to happen? Well, we have America over here, USA. You probably can't read that. We have America, USA, right? America is the biggest pie. Then we have tiny little Bitcoin here. It's not yet grown to the size I drew, right? We have tiny little baby Bitcoin that nobody cares about and everybody ignores, right? We have America, we have Bitcoin, we have stonks. We have stonks over here, specifically US stonks, because US stonks go up the most, right? US stocks, we have bonds, and I know that for all those in the comments hating on me, I know and understand that there are not nearly, that the total market cap of dollars is not nearly as big as stocks or bonds. I get that, okay? But for the sake of example, the total political power of the United States is the biggest system in the world, right? I guess you can include bonds and all that, right? But then you have all these tiny little countries, right? You got Thailand, you got Bulgaria, you got France, Germany, UK, Canada, right? You have all these other little countries, right? This is the world we live in right now. Because every single political currency system in the world today is trying to be an accounting system, right? That is trying to have the biggest pie possible via diluting the most possible, right? How does America get a larger pie? Well, we dilute currency tokens into existence, print a bunch of money, go to war, take some resources to grow the pie, right? Theft is the way you grow the pie in the system because no new wealth is created from printing new currency units, right? And so we have all these political currency systems in the world, like literally hundreds of them. There's a big one and lots of little baby ones. So what I think is going to happen is that more and more energy is going to flow into the dominant political currency system, which is the US dollar, okay? As the dollar gets stronger relative to all these others, the theft has to increase, the censorship has to increase, that energy has to flow in here. However, the dollar system is not a monetary black hole. Bitcoin is a monetary black hole because we don't know how to kill it. And it's a baby, right? You can have Jupiter and all the little moons, but if you put a black hole the size of a pinhead next to Jupiter, it is a matter of time until the black hole absorbs everything, all of the mass in the solar system, right? Because a lot of people, a lot of human brains look at size and they think that's all that matters, but it's not size that matters. It's survivability and scalability of the system. You can have a very large system that's not stable, but if you have a smaller system that is stable and that all it does is eat more energy, and perpetually spit out less and less currency units, diluting the system to keep it alive until in 2140, there's nothing left, and then you reach theoretical infinity, right? It's the same kind of concept. Bitcoin's a tiny little pinhole of a black hole. It's the size of a pea. It's a baby little pea. And people look at it and say, oh, the pea's worth $100,000. It's so expensive. I remember when it was the size of a neutrino. Oh, it's over. I am too late. Then you got freaking Jupiter and all the planets, all the moons. Sure, they can crash into Jupiter and they'll give the planet a much larger mass. Sure, they'll give it more energy, but ultimately, the black hole is the one that's going to win because it's the singularity, right? And this is the thing people don't understand. The majority of productivity is in front of us, and therefore, the majority of dilution has to be in front of us. We can't allow prices to go down. We can't allow the purchasing power of a share of the pie to go up, because that would then nullify the interest rates that are coming out every single year to keep the Ponzi scheme going. So the majority of printing is in front of us. The majority of these countries collapsing into America is in front of us. There are good things about that. There are less good things about that, right? I have criticisms of the United States, but I'd rather see the United States get more monetary power than North Korea, as an example, right? There are trade-offs to all of that. You can make your own opinions if you like what I'm saying or you don't. I'm just telling you what I think is going to happen. And what I think is going to happen is that if Bitcoin were to take over the purchasing power of the world, and if Bitcoin were to be what's called a triple point asset, where it's a store of value, immediate exchange, and immediate account, better than stocks, better than dollars, better than gold, all three at the same time, what will Bitcoin be if that were to happen? Well, the current purchasing power of the world is 900 trillion America bucks. Okay, $900 trillion is the total amount of global wealth. And if Bitcoin is a monetary singularity and it absorbs that wealth, that would be about $45 million per Bitcoin. Okay, now I'm getting a little off the screen over here, but 45 million bucks of Bitcoin. Here, I'll draw it over here. 45 million America bucks for a single Bitcoin. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of political currency. Am I saying that's going to happen next year? No. Am I saying that's going to happen in the next 10 years? No. But if your time horizon is longer than that of a goldfish, and you understand that the majority of productivity is in the near future, not in the ancient past, if you understand what's coming, if you understand that the moons are going to collapse into Jupiter at a faster and faster rate, and we're going to go from a neutrino to a pea, to a baseball, to a basketball, to the size of a stadium, to the size of a small moon ourselves, right? If you understand where we're going, you understand that energy can flow into the black hole, but it's not going to flow out of it, right? All these open systems can crash against each other as much as they want, but once it goes into Bitcoin, it's not coming back, because it's getting ever closer to infinity. We're getting ever closer to what is required, being an infinite amount of energy to create an infinitesimally small share of the network, right? So 45 million bucks per Bitcoin. Okay, here's the thing. Over the course of the coming decades, we're going to have 4 times more productivity in the next 50 years than the last 4,000 years. And so really, we got to add a zero. We got to add a zero. Why? Because we have less economic future in the past, we're adding more productivity to the world, right? We're building more stuff. We're going to have more humans, be more efficient. We're going to have more robots and automation, be more efficient. And ultimately, we're not going to be talking about X amount of purchasing power for the world. We're going to talk about something 5, maybe even 10 times greater. The majority of people today still make less than $30 a day. The majority of people today in 2025 are still relatively poor. Not nearly as much as before the Industrial Revolution, but we have less in common with the near future than the past. There are more people in the next 50 years that are going to enter wealth than the previous 4,000 years. The majority of homicides are in the future, not the past. The majority or the potential amount of deaths and wars are in the future, and the past. The majority amount of prosperity is in the future, not the past, right? In every single aspect, good and bad, there's a lot of change coming. And a lot of that change is going to be good in terms of productivity and bringing more productivity to more people. And so if we just 10x the global share of pie a few decades from now, and we subdivide it with the shares of a Bitcoin network, that's $450 million per Bitcoin. But since we're pricing it in terms of American political currency, of Eagle Bucks, of Donald Trump tokens, right? Or really more Jerome Powell tokens, right? If we're pricing in terms of that, well, we also know we have to print at least 10 times the political currency over the next few decades, because we're going to produce at least 10 times of the wealth in the future, right? And so if we're producing 10 times the political currency as we're producing more wealth, well then we got to add another zero. In nominal terms now, we're talking right? So yes, of course, when Bitcoin's $4.5 billion, sure, the average person is going to be making like 10 million bucks a year or whatever, right? And the average house is going to cost like $30 million or whatever, right? So obviously, now we're talking in nominal terms, but the larger point still stands. It doesn't make sense to say, oh, the black hole's the size of a pea now. It's too late. Oh, I'm too late. Like, no, you don't understand that it's in every single iteration that Bitcoin grows. Every single time the global pie of Bitcoin grows, the more likely it survives into the end game of what's happening, right? Bitcoin is cheaper now in 2025 than it was in 2012. And that gets all the people in the comments all angry. And sure, yes, obviously, it was literally cheaper back then than it was today. But when you're comparing risk versus reward, it is far cheaper today than it was back then, because it's literally multiple trillions times more energy, and it's literally hundreds of times more likely. We've gone from a 0.0001% odds of success to a 1% odds to now I think more like an 80% odds of success, right? Some people probably even say 90 or more than 90%, right? And we're going to get ever closer to 90.99999%. Ever closer. We'll never quite hit infinity. We'll never quite hit 21 million Bitcoin, but we'll get ever closer to it. Infinitely close, as close as we possibly can. And so that is what I think is the way to think about it. And sure, Bitcoin's going to billions of dollars a coin in terms nominally. But today, if we were to divide today's wealth by the share of Bitcoin, that's about 45 million bucks of Bitcoin. Of course, there's some percentage odds that Bitcoin doesn't survive. There's some percentage odds that I'm wrong. There's some percentage odds that this future doesn't happen. Okay, let's say there's a 10% chance I'm right. That's still $450 million of Bitcoin. Let's say there's a 20% chance I'm right. That's $900 million of Bitcoin in nominal terms, right? The point is, everyone in the world right now is betting on either Jupiter or some moon or satellite orbiting Jupiter. And right now, a lot of people say, oh, well, Bitcoin's a scam, huh? All those Bitcoin maxis, well, the Bitcoin, the black hole only has value because it's orbiting Jupiter. It's no different than any of these other little moons. No, it's like, you don't understand how the dilution within Bitcoin works compared to the dilution of everything else. This is a closed system. Everything else is an open system. This retains its energy. Everything else dilutes its energy. And just because the black hole may look a little bit different, or just because it may look a little bit similar, and it's orbiting the big celestial body, kind of like all the other systems, you have to understand that it's eventually going to win. Just the question is when. And so sure, is $500 million of Bitcoin unreasonable for next week, next month, next year, probably even the next couple decades? Sure, absolutely, of course, right? But your problem is not that you don't disagree with me. Your problem is that your timeline is too short. Okay, I'm thinking ahead for the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years. You're thinking ahead to the next quarter, right? You're thinking ahead to the next sports game or the next fiscal year, right? It's just a totally different mindset. What I would encourage you to do, and the reason why I make all these videos and talk about this, is because this is the greatest opportunity in the history of mankind, monetarily speaking. You have the power to teleport energy into the future. You have the power to buy energy from 4,000 years ago and send it to Nikola Tesla. You have the power to buy energy from 4,000 years ago and teleport it to your great-grandkids. You have the power to send energy and send it wherever you want into the future, okay? Because there's more productivity in the next iteration than the last 1,000 iterations, right? And by buying a share of the network today, right? This is your little tiny share, right? This right here is your tiny little share, right? This is you, okay? This is your share of the network. That's the tiny little black hole that's going to absorb everything. And everything is going to be dwarfed by what comes next. If you buy Bitcoin today, you are effectively sending energy from the past into the future. In the same way you can send a photon at the speed of light, in the same way you can change the temperature of something, you can send energy for basically nothing, for something in exchange for a lot in the future, right? You have the ability to convert a pound of salt into a pound of gold. Because in the future, a pound of gold is going to take less energy to produce, right? And we're going to have more productivity in the future, right? This is the same kind of concept. Should you spend all of your earnings living on Bitcoin? No. Like, you got to eat, you got to live, you got to have a house, you got to have water, of course, right? But for any energy you want to send to your grandkids, that you want to send to your future church, that you want to send to your future descendants, that you want to send to the corporation or the business or the country that you desire in the future, Bitcoin is basically time-traveling energy, which sounds a little crazy. And maybe I am, but I don't think I'm wrong. So Bitcoin is super stupid dirt cheap if your time horizon is that of decades, Bitcoin is far more likely to go to $500 million than to stop at $500,000, okay? It makes no sense to me. Why on Earth, or why in the solar system, why would Bitcoin stop at $500,000? Why would the black hole stop eating all the celestial bodies when it gets to the size of a beach ball? Why would it stop? It's more likely to continue the larger it grows. Bitcoin will be cheaper 10 years from now than it is today. Oh, but look, the price is going to be higher 10 years from now. What do you mean? In terms of risk and reward, it's going to be even more obvious to do. As the black hole grows, it gets more obvious to capitulate into the black hole. That's what Bitcoin is. It is an accounting system that has way more in common with the laws of nature, not because Bitcoin is divine, not because Bitcoin is outside of space and time, but the concept of digital scarcity. We have not known how to create an algorithm ever before until Satoshi, part by chance and in large part due by skill, figured it out. People tried for decades. They figured it out. And this is what Bitcoin represents. But all Bitcoin is, it's the meter stick. All Bitcoin is the Kelvin system. It is just measuring the concept of digital scarcity, right? And the one thing that would change my mind about all this, that would cause me to capitulate on Bitcoin and give up, the one thing that would cause me to change my mind is if for some reason I believed that the network couldn't sustain. But I do not yet know, I cannot yet conceive of a way that could happen, okay? How secure is Bitcoin? How secure is SHA-256? How secure are the elliptical curves and all that? You would have to disassemble the sun. You need a computer with close to absolute zero, right, which is already basically impossible. You need even more energy to do that and keep the temperature down to avoid inefficiency with the computer. But you need a computer, essentially, that could turn the sun into a constant stream of electrons that you'd have to flow through this computer for likely hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, and then you might be able to crack it. Of course, there's quantum computers that could be a potential threat, but guess what? If it's a threat to this, it's a threat to everything else. And this has every economic incentive to be ahead of everything else, right? So I do not yet know how we can kill Bitcoin. And as long as this thing, in my eyes, remains a black hole and not just another little moon, I can't help but say Bitcoin is lower risk than everything else in the solar system. The black hole is lower risk to bet on than everything else in the solar system. Everybody on Mars, everybody on Jupiter, everybody in America and China and Japan look at the little black hole and they say, I can't even see it. I can't even touch it. It's not tangible. Have you been there? Nobody's been in the black hole. It's so small. It's smaller than a small moon, right? You're crazy for saying Bitcoin's lower risk. You're irresponsible. But once you understand that the future we have less in common with the near future and the past, and you understand that for that future we need an accounting system that isn't reliant on human emotion and behavior, but that's reliant on mathematics and the concept of energy and digital scarcity, then you understand the best form of money is Bitcoin. Because it is the pie, it is the circle that's going to grow by orders of magnitude when compared to everything else, and you can own a slice of that pie and you're not going to be diluted forever. You're going to be diluted at a forever smaller rate as we forever approach an infinite amount of energy to create the last single Satoshi. So get you some Satoshis. Thank you for your time.